In this video, we'll explain the purpose of the row of icons at the top of the array listing on the Modifiers page. We'll also see 3 examples of using the Array modifier to create models, such as a chain, a fence, and a spiral staircase. At the very top of the Array modifier's area are a set of icons that appear in all modifiers. The first icon is used to minimize or expand the modifier's details. The next field allows us to assign a name to this particular copy of the modifier. The next symbol is the on-cage icon, which operates only in edit mode. Normally, when we enter edit mode, only the original object displays its component vertices, edges, and faces. However, if we activate the on-cage option, the elements created by the modifier are also visible. We can then edit either the original or one of the new elements. Which we choose doesn't really matter, since any changes we make to the original or one of the copies affects all the copies and the original. The Edit Mode icon, when activated, displays the effects created by the modifier when working in edit mode. If it's not switched on, only the original object will appear. The Real-Time icon must be selected in order for the effects of the modifier to appear in the 3D viewport. This controls the effect's visibility in both object mode and edit mode. The Render icon must be selected if the effects of the modifier are to appear in the final render. The drop-down button shows 2 active options. The Apply option will turn the effects created by the modifier into real objects. In the case of our cube example, each additional cube created by the Array modifier would become a separate mesh. Once we've selected this option, the modifier is removed from the Modifiers page. Although Blender has created actual cubes when the Array modifier was applied, they are joined together to form a single entity in the same way that we used Ctrl-J in a previous video to join elements together. To separate the cubes, we need to select the cubes and enter Edit Mode by pressing the Tab key. Pressing A will ensure that all the elements are selected. The final step is to press P, and in the Separate pop-up menu that appears, select By Loose Parts. Each cube is now a separate object, and we can tab back to Object Mode. But there is still one problem to solve. Click on any of the cubes, and you'll see that they all have their origin at the center of the original cube. To move each origin to the center of its own cube, we need to select all the cubes. Then, in the main menu of the 3D viewport, choose Object, Set Origin, and Origin to Geometry. Now each cube has its origin at its own center. Returning to the modifier's drop-down options, the next is Duplicate. This applies another copy of the modifier to the result created by the original modifier. Notice that there are now 2 array modifiers listed, and that each modifier has its own unique name. If we adjust the relative offset in the second modifier to 0 in the x direction and 1.1 in the y direction, we get a grid of cubes. And by choosing Duplicate from the new instance of the Array modifier, we get yet one more copy. If we change the offset to be in the z direction, we get a cube of cubes. When more than one modifier is applied to an object, Blender applies them in the order they are given in the list, top one first. If we look at the drop-down list of the middle modifier, we'll see that 2 more options have become available. These are Move to First and Move to Last. These can be used to move that particular modifier to the top or bottom of the list. An alternative way of rearranging the modifier order is to drag from the top right corner of the modifier being moved. Since, in our example, all 3 modifiers are of the same type, with similar parameter values, the order in which they are executed makes no difference to the final result. But as we will see when we have discussed other modifiers, this is not always the case. If our scene contains other objects, and we have more than one object selected, the modifiers being applied to the active object, that is, the last object to be selected, are displayed in the modifiers page. Having multiple objects selected also activates the last of the options in the modifiers drop-down list, Copy to Selected. Choosing this entry from the list will apply that modifier to all the other selected objects. The final modifier option is symbolized by the X icon. Clicking here will delete the modifier from the selected object. Now, let's have a look at some of the models we can create using the array modifier. For the first example, we'll start with a torus and shrink it in the Y direction only. Now, we'll use Shift-D to make a copy and press Escape so it doesn't move from its original position. Next, we'll rotate the copy by 90 degrees about the X-axis and move it along the X-axis until the two meshes are just touching. After selecting both shapes, pressing Ctrl-J will join them into a single object. If we apply the array modifier to this shape, we can create a chain. A relative offset value of about 0.8 in the X direction should position the first and subsequent copies in the correct position. Our next example involves a slightly more complex initial shape made from cubes. We'll scale the first cube in the Z and Y directions to create the shape of a wooden plank. Pressing Shift-D will make a copy which will move up in the Z direction. We'll add another cube and scale it as necessary to represent a wooden post, which we'll place in the middle of the two existing objects. After selecting all three objects, we'll press Ctrl-J to merge them and then add an array modifier to create a fence-like structure. Now we'll add another cube and select it as the start and end objects in the array's cap parameters. Why aren't we getting cubes at either end of the fence? The reason is that we forgot to apply the scale to the fence sections after we scaled their original cubes, and now Blender has applied the same scale factor to the cubes on the ends of the fence, resulting in what looks like more planks. To solve this problem, all we need to do is select the fence and choose Object, Apply, Scale. This resets the fence's scaling factors to 1, causing the end cubes to have that same scaling factor applied, returning them to their original size. For our final model, we'll start with a cube and resize it in the Z and Y directions. This time, we'll remember to apply the scaling. Now we'll move the cube about 1 meter along the X-axis, but returning its origin to the world origin. Now we'll add an empty before reselecting the cube and assigning it an array modifier. We'll set the count field to 60 and change the relative offset to 1 in the Z direction. We'll set object offset to attach to the empty before selecting the empty itself and rotating it around the Z-axis using the expression 720 divided by 60. Now we have a spiral staircase, but the inner edge doesn't look too realistic. So to hide that problem, and also to reflect the fact that stairs in the real world need to be attached to something, we'll add a cylinder and scale it in the Z direction. Scaling using the Scale Cage tool lets us scale the cylinder in the upward direction only, before making slight adjustments to finish off the model.